Her hands trembled for a bowl of soup until a cowboy said, "You'll never go hungry as my wife." The November wind cut through the threadbare fabric of Clara's shawl like a knife through worn leather. She pressed her face against the frosted window of Murphy's General Store, watching steam rise from bowls of beef stew inside, while her empty stomach cramped with a familiar ache. 4 days without a proper meal had left her hands trembling, though she told herself it was only the cold seeping through her fingerless gloves. The wooden boardwalk creaked beneath her worn boots as she shifted her weight, trying to summon the courage to enter. Inside, she could see families gathered around small tables, their faces warm and content in the lamplight. The smell of beef and potatoes drifted through the crack beneath the door, making her mouth water, despite her pride. Clara had been many things in her 26 years. A merchant's daughter in St. Louis, a governess to wealthy children, a seamstress in a cramped boarding house, but never a beggar. Yet here she stood in Cedar Ridge, Wyoming Territory, with nothing but 37 cents in her worn leather purse and nowhere left to run. The bell above the door chimed as she finally stepped inside, her entrance drawing curious glances from the patrons. She kept her chin raised, despite the flush of shame burning her cheeks, walking to the counter where Mrs. Murphy stood, wiping down glasses with a stained apron. "What can I do for you, dear?" The older woman's voice carried the practiced kindness of someone who'd seen plenty of hard luck cases drift through town. Clara's throat felt dry as sandpaper. "I was wondering about the price of your beef stew. 25 cents for a bowl, comes with cornbread." The words hung in the air between them. Clara's hands trembled as she opened her small purse, counting the coins with fingers that seemed to betray her desperation. 25 cents would leave her with barely enough for a single night's lodging in the stable loft, and winter was settling over the territory like a heavy blanket. "Perhaps just the cornbread," she whispered, hating the way her voice cracked. Mrs. Murphy's expression softened. "Honey, when's the last time you had a proper meal?" Before Clara could answer, the door opened again, letting in a gust of cold air and a tall figure in a weather-beaten coat. She didn't turn around, too focused on the mortifying conversation with the storekeeper, but she heard the steady rhythm of boots on wooden planks and caught the scent of leather and wood smoke. "Evening, Mrs. Murphy." The voice was deep, with the slow cadence of a man who chose his words carefully. "I'll take my usual and whatever the lady's having." Clara spun around to face the stranger who'd spoken. He was taller than most men she'd known, with shoulders that filled his coat and hands that looked like they'd seen honest work. His dark hair showed beneath a black hat that had seen better days, and his eyes, a startling shade of green, studied her with quiet intensity. "I don't need charity," she said quickly, though her stomach betrayed her with a low growl. He tipped his hat slightly. "Didn't figure you did. Just thought you might keep me company while I eat. Gets lonely sometimes, sharing a meal with just yourself." There was something in his manner that made her hesitate. He wasn't offering pity exactly, but something closer to simple human kindness. Still, pride was often all a person had left when everything else was stripped away. "I'm quite capable of paying for my own food," she replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "I'm sure you are." He settled onto a stool at the counter, not pressuring her, but not withdrawing the offer either. "Name's Ezra Callahan. I work the Triple Bar Ranch about 10 miles north of town." Clara found herself studying his profile as he spoke with Mrs. Murphy about ranch business and weather. There was something steady about him, like a rock in a swift-moving stream. When he caught her looking, she quickly turned away. "Clara Whitmore," she said finally, accepting the stool beside him. "Mrs." Murphy set 2 bowls of stew on the counter, along with thick slices of bread still warm from the oven. The first spoonful nearly brought tears to Clara's eyes, not from the heat, but from the simple mercy of it. She tried to eat slowly, to maintain some dignity, but her body's need overrode her social conditioning. "You're not from around here," Ezra observed, not making it sound like an accusation. St. Louis, originally, she broke off a piece of bread, savoring the texture. I came west to be a teacher in Cheyenne, but the position fell through. It was a simplified version of the truth. The position hadn't fallen through. She'd fled when her employer's advances became impossible to ignore, and his wife had blamed her for his wandering hands. But that was too much shame to lay on a stranger, even one buying her dinner. Cheyenne's got plenty of opportunities for someone with education, Ezra said carefully. Might be worth another try. Clara nodded, though she knew she'd burned that bridge along with several others. I'm considering my options. They ate in companionable quiet for a while, the warmth of the food and the shelter gradually thawing more than just her chilled bones. Other patrons came and went, their conversations creating a comfortable backdrop of ordinary life. Where are you staying? Ezra asked as they finished their meal. The boarding house on Main Street, another half-truth. She'd stayed there the previous 2 nights, but couldn't afford another. He nodded, fishing coins from his pocket to settle the bill. Mrs. Kowalski runs a decent place. Clean beds, fair prices. Clara watched him count out the money, noting the calluses on his hands and the careful way he handled his wages. This wasn't a wealthy man showing off, but someone who understood the value of every coin. Thank you for dinner, she said, meaning it. I'll find a way to repay you. No need. Ezra stood, settling his hat more firmly on his head. Though if you're still looking for work, the Triple Bar could use help in the kitchen. Cook took ill last week, and we're making do with beans and hardtack. The offer hung between them, loaded with possibility and risk. Clara had learned to be wary of men who offered easy solutions to desperate women, but something in Ezra's steady gaze suggested this wasn't that kind of proposition. What would the work involve? She asked carefully. Cooking for about 12 hands, keeping the kitchen clean, maybe some mending. Boss provides room and board plus $30 a month. He paused, seeming to choose his words. It's honest work if that's what you're after. $30 a month was more than she'd made as a governess, and room and board would solve her immediate problems. Still, she'd heard stories about what could happen to unprotected women on isolated ranches. I'd need some kind of assurance about my safety, she said, meeting his eyes directly. Ezra's expression grew serious. Fair enough. Ranch owner's a good man. Marcus Reed fought with the Union cavalry. His wife Sarah runs things with a firm hand. Any man who stepped out of line wouldn't last a day on the Triple Bar. The mention of a wife on the ranch eased some of Clara's concerns. When would I start? Tomorrow, if you're willing. I can come by with a wagon around 8. Clara nodded slowly. It wasn't the future she'd planned when she'd left St. Louis, but it was better than the alternative of slowly starving in a hostile territory. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the wooden sidewalks like scattered diamonds. Clara packed her few belongings, 2 dresses, some undergarments, her mother's Bible, and the small leather-bound journal where she recorded her thoughts, into a worn carpet bag. She'd spent the night on a bench in the train station, wrapped in her shawl and trying to stay warm. Ezra arrived precisely at 8, driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 bay horses. He helped her up to the seat beside him without comment on her obvious fatigue, settling a thick blanket around her shoulders before taking the reins. The road to the Triple Bar wound through rolling hills, covered in brown grass that rustled in the wind like whispered secrets. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already touched with snow. Clara had grown up surrounded by brick and cobblestone, and the vastness of this landscape both thrilled and intimidated her. It's beautiful, she said, as they created a ridge, and the valley spread below them. Gets into your blood after a while, Ezra replied. Hard country, but fair if you treat it right. The ranch buildings appeared gradually. First a large barn and several corrals, then a substantial 2-story house with smoke rising from multiple chimneys, and finally a collection of smaller structures including what she assumed was the bunkhouse. Everything looked well maintained despite the obvious challenges of frontier life. Sarah Reed met them at the kitchen door. a woman in her 40s with graying brown hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take Clara's measure in a single glance. She wore a practical dress covered by a spotless apron, and her greeting was warm but businesslike. "So you're the young lady Ezra mentioned. I'm Mrs. Reed, but you can call me Sarah. Come in, out of the cold." The kitchen was a revelation. Spacious and well-equipped, with a large cast-iron stove, multiple work surfaces and shelves lined with jars and supplies. The warmth wrapped around Clara like an embrace after the chill of the wagon ride. "Ezra tells me you can cook," Sarah continued, pouring coffee into 3 cups. "What's your experience?" "I managed the kitchen for the boarding house where I lived in St. Louis," Clara replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Cooked for 20 people regularly. I also know some fancier dishes from my time with a family as their governess." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Good. The men aren't particular about fancy, but they need hearty food that'll stick to their ribs. Breakfast at 5, dinner at noon, supper at 6. Sundays are a bit more relaxed." Clara felt a flutter of nervousness. 12 men is quite a few to cook for. "You'll manage fine," Sarah assured her. "I'll help you get started, and most of the supplies are already laid in for winter. Your room's upstairs, second door on the right. Plain but comfortable." The room was indeed plain. A narrow bed, a small dresser, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the corral. But it was clean and private, with a wool blanket on the bed and curtains at the window. Clara had stayed in worse places during her journey west. That first week passed in a blur of early mornings and aching feet. Clara threw herself into the work with desperate determination, rising before dawn to start the fires and begin breakfast preparations. The ranch hands were initially skeptical. She could see it in their sideways glances and careful politeness, but her cooking gradually won them over. She learned their names and preferences. Old Pete, who liked his coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. Young Jamie, who had a sweet tooth and always complimented her biscuits. Miguel, who missed the spicy food of his childhood in Texas. They were rough men, hardened by difficult lives, but they treated her with respect that seemed genuine rather than forced. Ezra was different from the others, though she couldn't quite define how. He was quieter, more observant, with a way of appearing when she needed help lifting something heavy or reaching a high shelf. His presence was unobtrusive, but somehow comforting, like having a steady friend nearby without the complication of expectations. "You're settling in well," Sarah observed one afternoon as they worked together preserving the last of the season's vegetables. "The men are eating better than they have in months." Clara felt a flush of pride. "It's good to feel useful again. Ezra mentioned you'd had some difficulties before coming here." Sarah's tone was carefully neutral. "You don't have to talk about it, but sometimes sharing helps." Clara's hands stilled over the potatoes she'd been peeling. She'd grown to trust Sarah over the past week, but the habits of secrecy died hard. "I made some poor choices," she said finally. "Trusted the wrong people. Found myself in situations where being a woman alone was more dangerous than I'd realized." Sarah nodded with understanding that spoke of her own experiences. "The world can be hard on women who don't have family to protect them, but you're safe here, Clara. Marcus and I made that clear to everyone the day you arrived." That evening, Clara found herself standing on the kitchen porch, watching the last light fade behind the mountains. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. "Peaceful out here," Ezra's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him approaching with 2 cups of coffee, steam rising from both in the cooling air. He handed her one and leaned against the porch railing beside her. "It is," she agreed. "Different from what I'm used to, but in a good way." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Clara found herself stealing glances at Ezra's profile, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way his eyes reflected the lamplight from the kitchen window. "Can I ask you something?" she said suddenly. "Sure." "Why did you help me that first night? You didn't know me, had no reason to trust me. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, seeming to consider his answer carefully. My mother died when I was 12, he said finally. Left my father to raise 3 boys on his own. He did his best, but times were hard. There were nights we went to bed hungry, and I remember the look in her eyes when she couldn't put enough food on the table. He paused, staring out at the horizon. You had that same look, proud but desperate, trying to hold on to dignity when everything else was slipping away. Figured if someone had helped her, maybe things would have been different. Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the quiet pain in his voice. What happened to her? Fever took her one winter. Father said she just didn't have the strength left to fight it off. Ezra's voice was matter of fact, but Clara could hear the old grief beneath it. Lost my brothers to various troubles over the years. Father passed 5 years ago. I'm sorry, Clara said softly. That must have been terribly difficult. Taught me that we're all just one piece of bad luck away from needing help, he replied. Makes you want to extend kindness when you can. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. She'd spent so much time running from men who wanted to take advantage of her vulnerability that she'd almost forgotten there might be those who simply wanted to help. As the weeks passed, Clara found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life. The work was demanding but satisfying, and for the first time in months, she felt secure in her position. Sarah had become both mentor and friend, teaching her not just about cooking for ranch hands, but about the subtle art of managing men who lived hard lives far from civilization. The first snow came in early December, transforming the landscape into something magical but treacherous. Clara stood at her bedroom window one morning, watching thick flakes swirl in the wind, and felt a moment of deep contentment. She was warm, fed, and safe, luxuries she'd learned not to take for granted. If this story has touched your heart so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with friends who love Old West stories. The contentment was shattered 2 days later when a stranger arrived at the ranch, riding through the storm with the determination of someone on urgent business. Clara was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she heard voices in the main house, one of them sharp with authority and uncomfortably familiar. Her blood chilled when she recognized the voice of William Garrett, her former employer from Cheyenne. Through the window, she could see him gesturing toward the kitchen while talking to Marcus Reed. Whatever story he was telling, it clearly wasn't flattering to her character. Clara's hands began to tremble as she considered her options. She could try to slip away, but the storm made travel impossible. She could attempt to explain her side of the story, but who would believe a desperate woman over a prosperous businessman? The kitchen door opened, and Marcus entered with a grim expression. Behind him came William Garrett, looking every inch the successful merchant in his expensive coat and gold watch chain. "Miss Whitmore," Marcus said carefully, "this gentleman claims to know you." William's smile was cold and predatory. "Indeed I do. Miss Whitmore was employed as governess to my children until she left under unfortunate circumstances." Clara lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of dignity she wasn't sure she possessed. "Mr. Garrett, I'm surprised to see you so far from Cheyenne. Business brings me through the territory regularly," he replied smoothly. "Imagine my surprise to learn that a woman of your reputation has found employment here. What exactly are you implying?" Marcus's voice carried a warning edge that Clara appreciated. William's expression grew serious, his tone taking on the weight of righteous concern. "I am afraid Miss Whitmore seduced my eldest son and attempted to extort money from my family when the relationship ended badly. She disappeared in the night with several valuable items that belonged to my wife." The accusations hit Clara like physical blows. Each word was carefully chosen to destroy her credibility, while painting William as the concerned citizen protecting an innocent family. "That's not true," Clara said, though her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "Then perhaps you'd care to explain why you left Cheyenne so suddenly," William pressed. and why my wife's pearl brooch was found missing the morning after your departure." Clara felt the walls closing in around her. The truth was complicated and ugly. William had been pressuring her for months, making increasingly inappropriate advances, while his wife blamed Clara for encouraging him. The night she'd finally decided to leave, William had cornered her in the parlor, his hands rough and his intentions clear. She'd fought him off and fled, but not before he'd torn her dress, and she'd knocked over a table in her desperation to escape. The pearl brooch had been a gift from William weeks earlier, pressed into her hands with whispered promises she'd never encouraged. She'd tried to return it several times, but he'd refused to take it back. In her haste to leave, she'd forgotten about it until she found it in her bag days later. "The brooch was a gift," she said quietly. "Mr. Garrett gave it to me despite my objections." William laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You see how she twists the truth? First seduction, then theft, now claims of inappropriate gifts. The woman is clearly disturbed." Marcus looked between them, his expression troubled. Clara could see him weighing William's apparent respectability against her months of honest work at the ranch. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "we need to hear this story from the beginning." Before Clara could respond, the kitchen door opened again, admitting Ezra along with a gust of cold air and swirling snow. He took in the scene with a quick glance, his eyes settling on Clara's pale face and trembling hands. "Everything all right?" he asked. Though his tone suggested he already knew it wasn't, William turned to him with the same false concern. "I was just explaining to Mr. Reed about Miss Whitmore's history of inappropriate conduct. As her current employers, you have a right to know about her character." Ezra's green eyes grew cold as winter stone. "And what character would that be?" "Seduction, theft, deception," William replied, clearly enjoying the drama. "The woman is a danger to any household that employs her." Ezra was quiet for a moment, his gaze shifting between William's smug expression and Clara's obvious distress. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being believed. "Funny thing about reputations," he said slowly. "Miss Whitmore's been here for months now, cooking for 12 men, living in the same house as a married woman, handling money and supplies. If she was the kind of person you describe, don't you think we'd have seen some sign of it by now?" William's confidence flickered slightly. "People can hide their true nature for a time, can they?" Ezra stepped closer, and despite being roughly the same height as William, seemed somehow larger. "Because I've known men who prey on women in vulnerable positions. They're usually real good at making their victims look like the problem when someone finally calls them on it." The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop another 10 degrees. William's face flushed with anger at the implied accusation. "How dare you suggest—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Ezra interrupted quietly. "Just noting that a man who'd chase a woman across 3 counties to destroy her reputation probably has reasons that ain't as pure as he's claiming." Clara felt tears threaten at this unexpected defense. No one had ever stood up for her before, especially not against a man of William's standing. Marcus looked thoughtful. "Mr. Garrett, why exactly did you come here? If Miss Whitmore stole from you, that's a matter for the sheriff." William shifted uncomfortably. "I thought you should know the kind of person you'd employed. As fellow businessmen, we have a responsibility to warn each other about unreliable help." "Right neighborly of you," Ezra drawled, "riding through a blizzard just to warn strangers about their kitchen help." Sarah Reed chose that moment to enter the kitchen, drawn by the tension that seemed to permeate the air. She took in the scene with the sharp intelligence Clara had come to appreciate, her eyes lingering on William's expensive clothes and calculated expression. "Is there a problem here?" Sarah asked, her tone deceptively mild. Marcus began to explain, but William interrupted, launching into his rehearsed accusations with renewed vigor. Sarah listened without comment, her expression growing increasingly skeptical as the story progressed. When William finished, Sarah turned to Clara. What's your side of this? Clara took a shaky breath, knowing this might be her only chance to tell the truth. Mr. Garrett employed me as governess to his children for 4 months. During that time, he made repeated unwelcome advances that I consistently refused. His wife blamed me for his behavior and made my position increasingly difficult. She paused, gathering courage. The night I left, Mr. Garrett cornered me and attempted to force his attentions on me. I fought him off and fled. The brooch he mentions was thrust upon me weeks earlier, despite my attempts to refuse it. In my haste to leave, I forgot it was in my bag. William's face darkened with rage. Lies, all lies. The woman is clearly... The woman, Sarah interrupted coolly, has been living under my roof for months. I think I'm qualified to judge her character. She turned back to Clara. Why didn't you go to the authorities? Clara's laugh was bitter. A governess's word against a wealthy businessman. In a town where he has influence and I have nothing, they would have dismissed my claims without investigation. Sarah nodded grimly. Unfortunately, you're probably right about that. William sputtered with outrage. You're actually believing her? This is exactly the kind of manipulation. That's enough. Marcus's voice cut through William's protests with quiet authority. Mr. Garrett, I think it's time you left. You're making a mistake, William warned. When that woman brings shame to your household, don't say I didn't warn you. I'll take my chances, Marcus replied firmly. Ezra stepped toward the door, opening it to let in a swirl of snow. Road's that way, he said conversationally. Weather's getting worse, so you might want to hurry. William gathered what remained of his dignity and stalked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back to Clara with a look of pure malice. This isn't over, he said quietly. Women like you always get what's coming to them eventually. The threat hung in the air after he left, poisoning the kitchen's former warmth. Clara sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. He'll try to destroy my reputation, she said dully. He has connections, influence. Even if you believe me, others won't. Sarah placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Let him try. We know who you are, Clara. That's what matters. But Clara shook her head. You don't understand. Men like him don't give up. He'll find ways to make life difficult for anyone who employs me. I can't let you suffer for helping me. Where would you go? Ezra asked quietly. Clara looked up at him through tears. She was trying hard not to shed. I don't know. Somewhere he can't find me. Somewhere his influence can't reach. And then what? Keep running every time someone from your past shows up. The question hung between them, highlighting the impossibility of her situation. Clara was tired of running, tired of looking over her shoulder, tired of being afraid. But she was even more tired of dragging good people into her problems. That evening, she packed her few belongings with heavy hands, planning to slip away before dawn. It seemed the kindest thing to do, disappear quietly and let the Reed family get back to their peaceful lives without the trouble she'd brought to their door. She was folding her second dress when a soft knock came at her door. Sarah entered without waiting for permission, carrying a cup of tea and wearing an expression Clara had learned meant business. Going somewhere? Sarah asked, settling into the room's single chair. Clara gestured helplessly at her carpet bag. I can't stay, not after today. That man will make life miserable for anyone who helps me. So you're just going to run away? Again? The words stung because they were true. Clara had been running for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand and fight. What choice do I have? She asked. I'm one woman with no money, no family, no connections. He's a wealthy man, with influence and resources. This isn't a fair fight. Sarah sipped her tea thoughtfully. You know, I wasn't always a ranch wife. Before I married Marcus, I was a saloon girl in Dodge City. Clara looked up in surprise. Sarah's refined manner and obvious education had made such a background seem impossible. Hard to believe, isn't it? Sarah continued with a wry smile. But it's true. I worked in dance halls and saloons for 3 years, doing what I had to do to survive after my first husband died. I've had men like your Mr. Garrett try to destroy me more than once. How did you escape it? I stopped running. Sarah's voice was firm. I realized that as long as I kept looking over my shoulder, I'd never be free. So I found good people, made a stand, and refused to let the past define my future. Clara felt a flicker of hope, quickly suppressed. It's different for you. You found someone who loved you enough to overlook your past. Sarah's smile was knowing. Did I, or did I find someone worth fighting for? Before Clara could ask what she meant, Sarah rose and moved toward the door. Think about it, Clara. Sometimes the thing we're running toward is right behind us, waiting for us to turn around. Clara spent a sleepless night wrestling with Sarah's words. Part of her wanted to believe that she could make a stand here, build a life despite William's threats. But years of disappointment had taught her to be cautious about hope. She was still awake when dawn broke, casting pale light through her window. The storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in pristine snow that sparkled like scattered jewels. It was beautiful, but somehow melancholy, like a promise that couldn't be kept. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. This time it was Ezra, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing an expression she couldn't quite read. "Heard you might be leaving," he said without preamble. Clara accepted the coffee gratefully. "It seems best for everyone." "Best for who? That snake who threatened you? Or the people who've come to care about you?" The word care hit her like a physical blow. She'd been alone for so long that the idea of people actually caring about her welfare seemed foreign. "I can't stay," she said weakly. "He'll make trouble for the ranch, for you and Sarah and Marcus. I won't be responsible for that." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, staring out her window at the snow-covered landscape. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "You know what I see when I look at you, Clara?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "I see a woman who's been knocked down more times than anyone should have to bear, but who keeps getting back up. I see someone who works harder than she needs to, treats people with kindness even when they don't deserve it, and carries herself with dignity even when the world tries to strip it away." Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks despite her efforts to control them. "I see a woman I'd be proud to call my wife," Ezra continued quietly, "if she'd have me." The words hung in the air between them, stunning in their simplicity and sincerity. Clara stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What did you say?" Ezra met her eyes directly. "I'm asking you to marry me, Clara, not out of pity or charity, but because I've never met a woman I respect more or enjoy being around more. Because when I think about my future, you're in every picture that matters." "You barely know me," Clara whispered. "I know enough. I know you're brave and kind and stronger than you think. I know you make the best biscuits in 3 counties and that you sing while you work when you think nobody's listening. I know you read your Bible every night and that you worry about everyone except yourself." Clara felt overwhelmed by the intensity of his words. But the scandal, the things William said, "Don't matter to me," Ezra interrupted firmly. "I told you once that you'd never go hungry as my wife, and I meant it. But it's more than that now. You'd never have to run again. You'd never have to face anything alone. Whatever comes, we'd handle it together." Clara found herself remembering Sarah's words about finding someone worth fighting for. Looking at Ezra, this steady, honest man who saw something in her worth protecting, she felt a spark of the courage she'd thought was lost forever. "Yes," she said simply. Ezra's smile transformed his entire face. "Yes? Yes, I'll marry you, if you're sure." Her words were cut off as Ezra crossed the room in 2 strides and gathered her in his arms. His kiss was gentle but thorough, tasting of coffee and promise, and the kind of hope Clara had almost given up on. They were married 3 days later in the Reed's parlor, with Sarah as witness and Marcus performing the ceremony in his capacity as territorial justice of the peace. Clara wore Sarah's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of dried wildflowers from the ranch's summer garden. The ranch hands gathered to wish them well, their genuine affection for both bride and groom evident in their gruff congratulations and awkward attempts at poetry. Even old Pete wiped his eyes when Marcus pronounced them husband and wife. That evening, as they sat together in the small cabin Ezra had built for their future, Clara felt something she'd never expected to experience: complete peace. The world beyond their door might be uncertain and sometimes cruel, but here, in the circle of Ezra's arms, she was finally home. No regrets? Ezra asked softly, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her arm. Clara thought of William Garrett, probably back in Cheyenne by now, nursing his wounded pride and plotting whatever revenge he imagined he was owed. She thought of all the years she'd spent running, all the nights she'd gone to bed hungry and afraid. Then she looked at her husband's face in the lamplight, saw the love and protection there, and smiled. None at all, she said, and meant it. The future stretched before them like the vast Wyoming sky, sometimes stormy, sometimes clear, but always infinite with possibility. And for the first time in her life, Clara Callahan wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. As winter settled over the Triple Bar Ranch, wrapping the land in silence and snow, two hearts that had wandered long and far finally found their way home to each other. And in the warmth of their small cabin, with the wind singing outside and love burning steady as a hearth fire within, they began to write a new story, one where the past couldn't touch them and the future held only promise. The stories shared in this channel are works of fiction created for entertainment and inspiration. They are not intended to represent real events or people, nor to offend anyone. If you enjoyed this tale of love, redemption, and second chances on the American frontier, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, comment with your thoughts, and share it with others who appreciate stories of the Old West. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we look forward to sharing many more stories with you soon.